Hero Time, Chapter 35, New Allies. Things went wrong almost as soon as they found the dragon. Jen had been thinking since she'd seen it take down the fighter jets. It hadn't gone after the pilots. They'd parachuted away, but the dragon hadn't gone after them. Why? If the knights were right, and that was a massive if, then this was a mindless creature bent only on destruction. But that's not what Jen saw when they pulled up into the open field. No, when the knights stepped out of their armor-plated vehicle, the dragon roared in anger and turned towards them. It had regarded Kevin's car with simple curiosity. But Jen heard something under the roar. No, never! It was like the dragon was trying to speak, but couldn't quite form words. Then, as it turned away, Jen spotted what looked like a tear down the dragon's side, under the wing. She frowned and spun the dial on the Omnitrix. Gwen caught her hand. "What's the plan here?" Jen glanced over at the knights. There were a few close enough to hear them. "Remember the Kraken?" Gwen nodded, eyes widening. "You think?" "Probably not exactly, but likely similar, yeah. Looks hurt, too." Kevin nodded, though he was slightly confused. He had no idea what they were talking about when they talked about a kraken, but it did look like Connor had managed to clip the dragon. With the latest weapon, a long enough sustained blast would probably kill it. Jen paused, then spun the dial again. She slapped it down, and her skin hardened as crystals spread through her veins. In an instant, Chromastone stood before them. "Stay back. I'll handle this. Keep an eye on the knights." Kevin and Gwen nodded, and with that she quick-stepped forward. The dragon raised its hand at her approach. Jen raised hers in surrender. "Hey there, big guy." The dragon tried to speak again, but this time it was just patterned roaring. "Look, I get you're trying to talk to me, but I can't understand you." It roared in sequence again, then it blasted. It definitely wasn't fire. Felt more like lasers. The fight didn't last long, mostly because the knights double-crossed them. It was extremely lucky Jen had changed her mind last minute and picked Chromastone. She was able to absorb the brunt of the blow meant for both her and the dragon. "Go!" The dragon seemed to understand that. A flash of pink across the field, and the knights that had accompanied Connor were trapped on the ground as the dragon took off, flying away. A blast from Chromastone knocked Connor off his feet, and the gun went flying from his hands. Jen stalked up to him as Gregory, pinned by the pink energy as well, stared at Connor, looking shocked. "We gave our word we would not harm her." The squire sounded downright indignant. "Does she look harmed to you, boy?" Connor snapped as Jen, still Chromastone, folded her arms. "You really have no idea what the organization you work for is really about, do you?" Gwen asked, shaking her head. Gregory looked down. "I think I am beginning to understand." Jen cut across the blonde, though she was talking to Connor. "We were expecting a double-cross, but that was not an unintelligent beast. And you know where it's headed, don't you? That's how you beat it to Bellwood in the first place." She looked down at the knight, who sneered at her. "I don't have to tell you anything, insolent child." He spat the words out at her, and Chromastone's eye narrowed. 200 North Peterson, where the 504 bridge meets the highway." Jen blinked and turned to Gregory. Connor snarled, and Kevin, covered in green cast iron that made up the frame of his car, stepped between the two. Jen nodded at Gwen, who released the blonde squire. "That's where the dragon is heading," the boy said, still sitting on the ground. Jen offered him a hand, and after a moment he accepted. She pulled him to his feet. "There's an artifact there. It got sent to that lab because several of the knights think it's alien. And the lab in Bellwood has the most experience with handling the more obscure alien technology." "Why would the dragon go after this artifact?" Jen asked, fully ignoring Connor now. "It was found with the dragon. We've never been able to figure out what it does, though." Jen nodded at Gregory. Connor seemed could hold his tongue no more. "Coward! Traitor!" Gregory held his ground and glared at the knight, who was twice his size. When I joined the Forever Knights, I thought I was joining a brotherhood, a group of honorable men. Now I see honor means nothing to you. Gregory spat the words at Connor, tearing the Forever Knight sigil from his doublet and throwing it to the ground. You should probably come with us. I feel like we can't leave you here. They might legitimately kill you. Jen said, looking at Connor's downright murderous expression. Gregory only deflated slightly as he nodded. If you will allow it, I would be more than grateful. Jen motioned to the car. As Gregory slid into the back seat, Jen blasted out the tires on the Knight's car. Can't have you following us. She nodded to Kevin and Gwen, and the three of them hopped into the car, Jen transforming seamlessly back to normal as she slipped into the car. They took off before the Knights could even start to get back up. Gregory was shaking. Jen patted him on the shoulder. You did the right thing. I'll be exiled from the Order. How am I going to get home? We took Connor's private jet here. We'll get you home. Least we can do. But you should stay here while we deal with the dragon. He nodded, and at Jen as he put his head in his hands. Just don't mess up my car, Kevin grumbled. Kevin, pull over. The Osmosian raised an eyebrow at the shapeshifter, but nodded and pulled over to the side of the road. Jen hopped out of the car and popped the trunk. She rummaged around the crates for a minute and made a noise of triumph as the others came around the car to see what she was doing. She pulled out a rounded dome-like device. What is this? She asked, waving the device at Kevin.
Galvin translator box. It's an older model, but it runs. Translates the speech of any alien who wears it into the native of whoever's listening. Don't ask how it works. That bit of Galvin tech always went a bit over my head.
The dragon was wearing one of these, but it looked busted. I think I caught a few words here and there, but nothing definite. There are legends of the dragon being able to speak, but no one ever puts any credence to it. Jen slammed down the trunk, translator still in hand. So we get this thing in place of the old one, and get him off planet before the Knights can kill him. The dragon is really an alien. Gregory sounded downright shocked.
If Jen's right and it's a translator, then yeah,
Kevin said as they all got back into the car. Getting the translator on the dragon turned out to be the easy part, even though it required both Jen and Gwen with an assist from Spider-Monkey. Talking him out of going on a killing rampage was the hard part. Jen stood just herself before the dragon, both arms out, blocking him from leaving. With his gun. Fine, you're gonna have to kill me to get to them, the mapmaker growled. Move aside, child. He aimed his gun at her. She looked him straight in the face and held her ground. Go ahead, shoot me. They stared each other down for a moment, then he lowered his gun and sighed. How did you know I couldn't do it? He sounded exhausted. The pilots. You could have killed them easily, but you didn't. Go home. The mapmaker laughed bitterly. Child, with this wound I will not survive the journey. It's not exactly a short trip. Jen glanced down at the Omnitrix. I might have a way to help with that. She spun the dial and slapped it down. When the transformation was finished, she stood, marble skin glittering with green stars, as white hair flowed around her head, up in a complex braid. She was dressed in a green chiton, the Omnitrix symbol resting at the shoulder of the short dress as if there were a pin holding the whole thing together. Can I? The dragon nodded, and Jen stepped forward, pressing both hands to the wound like she'd seen Albrasix do, to the crashed and wounded mechamorph. As she made contact with the blood, she heard the voice of the Omnitrix, so like her own, in her own mind. New DNA sample acquired. She filed that away with a smile and focused on healing the dragon. In moments, the wound was a scar. He smiled at her. Then he frowned as the noise from outside grew more intense. The accursed knights will not just let me leave. Jen tapped the dial on the Omnitrix, turning back into a human before spinning the dial once more. I've got just the thing. Go home. I'll deal with the knights. Gwen and Kevin had lost the fight. Gregory had shown up. Brave Boy had taken one of the laser lances from Kevin's trunk, but had been disarmed. He was tossed down beside the two plumbers as Connor powered on his weapon and aimed it at them. You never got a chance to use it, though, for at that moment the wall of the warehouse burst open and Connor and the knights were bowled off their feet with a loud roar. Gwen cried out in protest. If the dragon was here to kill the knights, then what had she done to her cousin? But Kevin grabbed her hand and pointed as the dragon reared back to strike out at the knights. Where the translation device had sat on the dragon was a very familiar green and black symbol. Gwen let out a belt of laughter as she took in the appearance of the dragon. It really wasn't the same one. This one was smaller than the map maker, though not by much, and the eyes were green along with the underside of the wings. She roared again and smashed Connor's gun under her talons as the roar of engines sounded from the warehouse, and the ship inside took off out into the vast expanse of space. Gwen had never pondered on whether or not a dragon could smile, but apparently it could. Jen grinned as green lights flashed, and she dropped to the ground, rolling to her feet. She hadn't been out and out flying, but that would be fun as her newest transformation. She glared at Connor, and his knights were retreating. He was soundly defeated. Sorry, Sir Connor. Looks like your dragon got away. Connor lunged, only to be met with a concrete fist. Yeah, no. Kevin said, letting the concrete drop from around his hand. Nice new alien, Tennyson. Jen grinned. I'm gonna call her Greenwing. Gwen laughed as she helped Gregory to his feet. Come on, let's arrange to get Gregory here home. It took a few days and a phone call to an old contact of Jen's to get Gregory on a plane back to England. They waited on the airstrip, and Gregory twiddled his fingers as they waited. How come we're waiting on the tarmac? Kevin asked, as he pulled Gregory's suitcase out of the trunk. Jen had gone big chill and liberated it from the castle, which had been mostly abandoned. Just a few tapestries left and some crates full of furniture and non-essentials. It was unlikely they would be back since Jen knew about that base. Because Eddie is ostentatious? Gwen said, looking up. Jen nodded, shielding her eyes as a sleek black jet cruised in for a landing. There was a large logo on the side of the plane, a G and an S in gold. The door opened and a staircase folded out. Jen! Gwen! So lovely to see you both! Kevin blinked at the 16-year-old boy who stepped out of the plane. His black hair was slicked back and he wore a blazer and a Sumo Slammers t-shirt. He slid down the rail of the stairs and pulled Jen into a hug. I love what you've done with your hair. Eddie is Edwin Grand Smith, Kevin asked, sounding indignant. Gwen laughed loudly at his face. Kevin, this is Eddie Grand Smith. His grandpa and ours were old friends. We met when we were kids. Eddie, this is my boyfriend, Kevin Levin. Kevin's face went pink as Eddie looked him over and shook his hand. Lovely to see someone was smart enough to snatch Gwen off the market. She's quite the catch, you know. Jen laughed as Eddie clapped his hands. A butler, dressed in a crisp suit, stepped out of the plane laden with packages. I'm sorry I was late, but I brought presents. He had the butler put the parcels, all carefully wrapped in green and gold leaf, in the back of Kevin's car. This must be the friend I'm taking back to jolly old England for you. Jen nodded at Gregory, who looked a bit starstruck. This is Gregory Collins. He needs a lift back, and some help getting back on his feet. He helped us out quite a bit. Anything you could give would be amazing. Jen said her face was slightly pink as Eddie grabbed her hand and spun her like a professional dancer. She laughed as he winked. Anything for you. The two of you helped me see there's more to the world than what you can see. Any Tennyson needs help, all they have to do is give me a call. He spun her again as she laughed, her face going red. By the way, Grandpa's still working on the zoning for his next resort, but maybe you, Gwen, and Grandpa Max could come out for a preview when it's ready. You could even bring Kevin. Jen's face fell immediately. Eddie frowned. Could be just like old times, except I designed this one. Hopefully no alien squids attack this time. He seemed to be expecting the girls to laugh, but neither of them did. Kevin handed the butler Gregory's bags. You probably have a lot going on. You should get going. The butler nodded and loaded the suitcases onto the plane. Eddie's frown grew. Was it something I said? I promise, this resort isn't underwater. Gwen shook her head, scrubbing at her eyes. No, Eddie. Grandpa Max is gone. Eddie's jaw dropped. I'm so sorry, I had no idea. Jen shook her head. We haven't told anyone. It's alien stuff. Her voice gave out, and she took a deep breath, collecting herself. It was good to see you, Eddie. We do have to go, though. Jen slipped into the back of Kevin's car. Gwen caught Eddie's hand as he made to go after her. She's not really in a good place about it. I'll call and tell you everything when I can. We've got major things happening. Eddie nodded and hugged Gwen briefly. Talk to you soon, I hope. And I'm serious. Anything either of you need, I'm a call away. Gwen nodded as Eddie boarded the plane again and it took off. About a week later, Eddie brought Gregory into a building he'd be working in. It was more like a small village set into a tiny corner of the Scottish countryside, far away from any forever nights. I'm sure they'll love you, Eddie assured Gregory as he introduced him to the nurse at the front desk. Our residents have the best around-the-clock care. You'll be managing the library. They do love their books. Eddie checked his watch as they entered the library and he introduced Gregory to the head librarian. Sorry to introduce him, Dash, but I have a delivery to check on. Eddie bowed out as the head librarian began to show Gregory around. Most of the residents in the prestigious retirement village introduced themselves, but one of them sat in a corner reading a book with crossed swords emblazoned on it. Oh, that's old George. Poor guy never gets any visitors, but he's harmless. Just sits around reading fiction all day. Mostly stuff about knights, but he's been looking for some new reading material. Someone introduced him to sci-fi, and he keeps looking for stuff with shapeshifters. Though we don't have a lot of that here. Gregory nodded and looked back over at the old man one more time as the head librarian showed him to the elevator and the second story of the library. He couldn't shake the feeling that old George had looked familiar. Chapter 36. Corrupted. Jen frowned as she stepped into Ed's garage. Gwen frowned as she stepped into Ed's garage. She was looking for Jen, who had promised to go shopping with her and Julie that night. Jen hadn't been big into shopping for a while now. Gwen silently put it down to the likelihood of being attacked in a large crowd going up, but she'd never asked. She didn't like tracking people unless she had to. It felt like an invasion of their privacy. She tapped on the hood of Kevin's car, lightly with her knuckle, just hard enough so he'd hear her. A soft swear and clatter of tools heralded Kevin rolling out from under the car.
Hey, Gwen.
He smiled, then checked his watch.
Thought I wasn't picking you and Julie up for another few hours.
You aren't. Gwen grinned, then her face fell slightly. I'm looking for Jen. I haven't heard from her in a few days. Kevin nodded, wiping the grease off his hands on a nearby rag.
She's been in the hole since your old buddy Eddie brought up Grandpa Max.
Gwen grimaced and Kevin nodded. These days, every time anyone mentioned Grandpa Max, Jen threw herself into her plumber work. It might not have been such a bad thing, except for the fact that she forgot about everything else. Eating, drinking, sleeping, they all got pushed aside in favor of the job. Gwen frowned as Kevin stood and stepped over to the fridge the mechanics used. He pulled out a bag from Burger Shack.
I tried to get her to eat earlier, but she ignored me.
Gwen hugged him tightly and kissed him on the cheek. It means a lot that you tried. I might have better luck, though. She took the bag from him and kissed him on the cheek again. He grinned as she headed down the elevator. She arrived, and was surprised to hear a voice she knew over the speakers. Your theory is sound. It's the execution that's shaky. We need to get a scan and test it. Gwen spotted Jen at one of the computers displayed on the screen was Cooper, long blonde hair pulled back into a short ponytail. I know. I've got someone working on getting us what we need to test the theory. Cooper spotted Gwen first and waved enthusiastically, tearing the rubber band from his hair. Hi, Gwen! He ran his hand through his hair, desperately trying to make it look presentable. Jen turned in her seat and waved at Gwen. She refocused quickly, though. You think you could do it, though? You'll need to get that containment room done soon, within the next few days. That's when he promised delivery. Cooper was still grinning at Gwen until Jen refocused the camera with a wave of the hand. Oh, yeah, it's ready whenever your guy pops by. Jen nodded. Good. Call me when he brings them in. Keep an eye on your equipment when he's around, and stash anything that looks expensive. He's got sticky fingers. Cooper nodded and waved to Gwen again before Jen cut off the call. Who's your guy? Gwen asked as she sat down next to her cousin. This was the first time she had heard about some semblance of a plan in a long time. Kevin put me in contact with Argit. I needed his skill set. Gwen frowned. What could you possibly need from Argit? 2 to 3 DNAliens? Jen said like she was making a shopping list. Gwen set the bag of burgers down in front of her cousin. What the hell are you up to, cuz? Jen pulled a burger out of the bag absently, not caring that it was cold. Cooper and I think we can mass-produce a cure if he can get a reading on how I do it. Argit is the only person we know who still has the connections to find the DNAliens and has the right power set to take them down without really hurting them. Gwen stared at her cousin. When did you turn into a tactician? Jen shrugged, her mouth full. It's not like I never learned, Gwen. Grandpa's not the only one who taught me either. Tetrax may have been way more intense, but he was a hell of a teacher. Gwen nodded slightly, conceding the point. Jen had spent some time alone in space with Tetrax, attempting to keep Gwen and Grandpa Max safe from the rapidly ticking down timer on the Omnitrix's self-destruct. It made sense that the bounty hunter had taught her some things, if only to keep her from using the Omnitrix. He'd also always had a soft spot for her, but it wasn't often that Gwen got to see the real leader in Jen come out, the one Azimuth had seen that day on Xenon when he decided not only stop the countdown, but allow Jen to keep the Omnitrix. But looking her cousin over, Gwen could see the emerging signs of exhaustion. You need to go home. Take a shower and get some sleep, the redhead stated, looking over the dark bags under her cousin's eyes, and the grease in her short hair. Jen looked up from her second burger. If Kevin was right, this was the first food she'd had in probably a day or more. I need to get back to work. Gwen shook her head at the brunette. You're not doing anyone any good if you collapse, especially if it ends up happening during a fight. Jen let out a deflated sigh. I hate it when you're right. Gwen grinned. I know you do. She ruffled her cousin's hair slightly. Jen finished her second burger and stuffed the trash back into the bag before crumpling the whole thing up and tossing it into a trash can. Rain check on the shopping trip? Jen asked as she stood. Gwen nodded. I'll make your excuses to Julie. Thanks. Jen waved as she made her way out of the hold. Gwen followed a few minutes later. Kevin grinned at her from under the hood of his car.
Jen took off on her bike. You're a miracle worker.
Gwen nodded, a slightly smug smile on her face. Oh, I know. Jen did manage to get a shower, but she couldn't sleep. Nightmares had been plaguing her for the past few days, losing feedback and Grandpa Max, ghost freak Vilgax with a sword to her arm. So she stayed awake, watching horror movies on her TV. There was a marathon of classics on at the moment, and Jen was having a blast. She'd discovered a love of cheesy, bad alien movies a long time ago, though most of the time she found herself sympathizing with the aliens more than the human characters. This one was no exception. Invasion of the Brain Snatchers was more about an evil scientist who was using the aliens to make zombies out of people. Having dealt with her fair share of evil scientists, she couldn't help but root for both the aliens and the people. Against the scientists, really. He sort of reminded her of Animo. Her parents were downstairs watching some historical drama on TV. They'd invited her to join, but she turned them down. She needed some time to herself, without the specter of having to eventually tell her parents what had happened to Grandpa Max hanging over her head. She had just gone to refill her popcorn when her mother stopped her in the kitchen. Is everything okay, Jen, sweetie? You've been spending awful lot of time out of the house lately. Jen set down her bowl as the bag in the microwave spun and popped. Yeah, everything's fine. Gwen and I have been hanging out a lot. Julie, too. Sandra smiled at her daughter. Good. I'm glad you and your cousin get along so well. I still remember when you would call each other names more than you would use your actual names. Jen grinned at her mother and refilled her bowl. Yeah, it's nice. Sandra hugged her daughter. You know we love you, Jen. Jen hugged her mother back, holding on a little tighter than she had for the last few years. It was hard, remembering that no matter what she did, all this sweet normalcy could be snatched from her in a moment, one way or another. Love you too, Mom. Jen made her way back to her room, pausing to hug her father, too, and sunk into her movie until the buzzing of her phone interrupted her. She flipped it open without ever taking her eyes off the TV. Hello? Gwen, spitting out an address as laser fire sounded through the background, had Jen vaulting to her feet, not caring about the popcorn now flying across the room, as she spun the dial on the Omnitrix and went diving out the window as Jet Ray. Nearly colliding with a Forever Knight mid-air on her way to rescue her cousin just made it worse. She was about to fly after him, but she spotted Julie's pink jacket next to the wreck that was Kevin's car, now covered in electrical burns and at least one laser hole that Jen could see. Julie was in tears. The Knights had taken ship. Jen was feeling slightly murderous. She was not okay with losing anyone or anything else right now. It took nearly 2 hours for Kevin to have his car running to the point where it wouldn't quit on them. Julie figured out where they should start looking, and refused to be left behind since Ship was her pet. But when they got there, it was Jen who spotted the open garage. Finding the Knights after that was easy. Dealing with the thing they claimed was Ship was not so easy. Jen had only ever encountered one red galvanic mechamorph before in her life, and she was about 2 minutes away from having a full-blown panic attack as her mind kept trying to sweep her back to the field where she'd lost feedback as Ship attacked them. She shoved Julie down behind a stack of crates. She knew she was shaking so hard it would be visible, but she couldn't do anything about that for the moment. She ignored Julie's concerned look and spun the dial on the Omnitrix. In the end, it was Julie who saved the day, reminding Ship of who he really was. Jen felt her heart rate slow as the red faded back to green and Ship reformed into his usual blob-like self in Julie's arms before turning on the Knights in full battleship mode. Still, even as the building was collapsing around them, it was hard for her to get on that ship. When they landed in Julie's backyard, Gwen wrapped her cousin in a hug and held on as the brunette shook. The redhead wasn't in much better shape. She shook off the questions from both Julie and Kevin as she held on like Jen was going to be ripped from her arms forever. It wasn't just Jen who had panicked at the sight of Ship, red like malware had been. The memory of her cousin screaming as part of her was ripped away from her forever was something that still haunted Gwen. She'd told Kevin that, but Julie looked confused and concerned. Gwen made a mental note to tell her what was happening later, as Jen was unlikely to. Ship was the one who ended up breaking between them. It wiggled into the embrace and into Jen's arms. The brunette tensed, and Gwen readied to throw Ship off of her, but she relaxed and hugged the dog-like mechamorph after it beeped at her questioningly. "I'm glad you're okay, Ship." Julie smiled as Ship beeped happily content in Jen's arms.